The third thing that I would say is that we just naturally seem to have a higher quotient of leadership coming out of the Caribbean. When I was at Harvard Business School, I was one of 5 people out of a class of 900 that had Trinidad and Tobago heritage. I was very proud of that. And these people looked like they came from all parts of the world, but they had Trinidad and Tobago heritage. And I think the fact that we were the highest per capita admissions rate from a particular diaspora says something. We might be small, but there's a certain punching above the weight class that we as a diaspora, whether it be the Caribbean or Trinidad or people of color have, that we tend to forget. And when we get into these different companies, people look to us as leaders, but we tend to eschew that in exchange for having more opportunity in what we feel is the more important technical domain. But sometimes playing the leadership role is more important than expressing your technical prowess. Because there's many people that could express technical prowess, right? Go hire out of China and India and Singapore and see what kind of quality of people you can get there, right? But you go ask someone from Singapore what they lack the most, and they will tell you it's leadership.
Interesting. In today's episode, my guest is Geoff Seyon. He is the founder and managing partner at Studio IXORA, a venture studio focused on applying explainable AI to industries such as finance and healthcare. Geoff is an entrepreneurial technological leader with 27 years of experience, inclusive of 15 years in globally distributed software delivery, digital health, and 10 years of hands-on experience with various artificial intelligence approaches and technologies. Prior to founding Studio IXORA, Geoff spent 15 years assembling, advising, and leading multiple teams that have created 7 digital health and 10 AI ventures. Before that, he also spent 5 years at Sapient, where he grew an office in India to 700 people and received the 2002 Sapiens Founders Award. Geoff holds a master's and bachelor's degree in electrical engineering and computer science with a concentration in AI from MIT, as well as an MBA from Harvard Business School. I hope you enjoy learning about Geoff's journey from the Caribbean to MIT and then to Silicon Valley. You will definitely learn what it takes to succeed in launching and managing large-scale successful businesses. There we go.
The show where we talk about data science in the Caribbean, highlighting practical ways that you can learn, get involved, and create your own impact using artificial intelligence and machine learning. This is the Caribbean Data Science Podcast with Mark Moyu and Geoff Seyon.
Hey, Geoff. Thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Mark.
We've been talking about different things about how we can get Caribbean people and people of the diaspora of the Caribbean to get into machine learning and artificial intelligence. So looking forward to hearing more of your perspectives based on your vast work history, as we'll hear more about. So let's get started with telling us a bit more flair about what you're doing right now, sort of where you're from, and I'll open the floor to you.
Sure, sounds good. So I'm originally from Trinidad, grew up in a small village called Guanapo Village, came to the US to go to MIT for university. And now I run Studio IXORA, which is a venture studio. We can talk more about what that is for people who may not know what venture studios are. And we're focused on accelerating people of color, especially in the fields of AI, data science, and healthcare, and anything related really to the economy that we're about to enter that will be based on heavily automated machines. So that's what we do.
Okay, fantastic. So you said AI. So there are many different definitions of AI. There's machine learning, there's data science. Can you give us a bit of your understanding and give us a bit more strict definition around how you present and speak about those topics?
Absolutely. I think it's really exciting that so many people from around the world, the Caribbean especially, are getting into the field. Most people start with the basics, which is the next generation of what in a previous generation would have been called statistics, which is the data science. And, coming from Trinidad, especially, people talk about data as being the new oil of the coming economy. And so I think it's really great that we have an economy that used to be the number one producer of oil way back in the day. We were one of the earliest producers of oil. And we might be a little bit late to mining the data, but I was very thrilled to see so many people jump onto some of the forums we've been hosting recently who are interested in the field. So hopefully the next Schlumberger might be started by somebody from Trinidad that sees the same value in mining and using the tools of data science to extract knowledge and information from the vast amounts of raw data which are just being exponentially generated today. So that's the field of data science. Built on top of that, now you have the computing capacity that is also growing exponentially today. And with that computing capacity, you have massively parallel types of computing infrastructures that allow you to learn from the data in supervised and unsupervised ways. So supervised learning is where you have some indication of what the data contains and you can go about in a structured fashion of extracting it. And then unsupervised is when you don't know anything about the data, or you know very little, and you want to just use a more brute force approach than having humans sift through millions and millions of records to try to figure out what insights might be available in the data. So machine learning can be used today because of the vast numbers of servers that companies like Google, Amazon, and others have put up in the cloud now. The affordability of massively parallel devices such as GPUs, graphics cards that you could buy as a consumer today and teach yourself on as a professional. And there's a heck of a lot that can be done with the machine. But then there's the field of artificial intelligence, which has existed from the 1950s. And we've been doing things which are smarter than a freshman at MIT with 100 lines of code, right? So you don't necessarily need massively parallel computing infrastructures to do something like differentiate any possible mathematical expression, right? That has been proven to be done in early theses of people, PhD students at MIT, to be done with so few lines of code that it could probably be run on a Commodore 64 from back in the day. So the reality is that artificial intelligence is more of an art, I would say, of bringing together the classical field of computer science with all of the algorithms and all of what would be more of a symbolic representation of human intelligence and human knowledge, with the things that can be gleaned through machine learning from the raw data to a unified set of utilities and a unified set of applications, so such that we could devise systems that support the demands for our coming economy. So that's how I differentiate data science from machine learning from artificial intelligence.
Perfect. And that was quite thorough. A couple of things that you said in there that I think stuck out in terms of how old the field is, right? There's a lot of buzz around these words right now. And I think for maybe newer students, they may think that, hey, this is a new thing that's coming up. But folks who've been in the field for a long time actually just see it almost as a compute accelerated version of what was there before, because a lot of things were not possible because the compute was not able to handle it. And, you said differentiating functions. So I kind of put you on the spot and ask, what would you say is what's the intuitive reason to understand differentiation, right? Sometimes a lot of us sit in calculus class and you're just like, why the heck am I learning this thing? And understanding what the true benefit of differentiation is in industry is quite helpful sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's a quite reasonable question to ask, and I'm glad that someone like you is asking it, right? I would even go so far as to ask, should we still be teaching our kids in elementary school to have to memorize what is 4 times 7, right? Because these were things that we used to have to do in our heads a few decades ago, and it was essential. You couldn't graduate from high school or certainly not college if you didn't know your 12 times tables. But today there's just so much more that can be done, and you can take advantage of the computers that the humans don't have to do so much heavy lifting. That doesn't mean that we can get any dumber. It just means that we can move to a different layer in the food chain. So similarly, I think it is still important to understand how one goes about procedurally running a differential equation, what the chain rule is, what different laws of mathematics are, so that you could understand and apply it conceptually as it comes about. But you don't necessarily have to remember what the integral of cosine x sine x is. Today, if you don't know that, you could go online and you could look it up. People have been building intelligent systems to do that now based on the work done many years ago. But you still have to understand it conceptually, right? I think a warning sign is any time you start trying to apply something where you've lost touch with the fundamental nature of how that knowledge and information was derived. There's always introduced a danger that people start doing things that they should not be doing. And so just keep that in mind, right? All of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s would remember a character on MTV and the music channels called Casey Kasem, who would say, you could reach for the stars, but make sure you keep your feet on the ground. Well, I'm paraphrasing of him. And I would say that the same thing is ever so more important, especially in a field like artificial intelligence, which purports to be able to change human civilization as we know it.
Understood. And one of the reasons I did bring that up is I think for a lot of young researchers and folks that are just getting into data science, machine learning, AI, whichever one we want to really talk about, there is this notion that you run some packages and you're doing certain things, right? And we always want to make sure that always saying that there's another level of the way that these things work, and having a fundamental understanding can go a long way in you actually extending things, building new applications and whatnot. So fantastic. I'd like to sort of switch into some motivation. Can you tell us what really motivated you to get into artificial intelligence? For me, what I do find interesting about your background is you were at the top institution of the world. MIT is sort of this renowned place. And tell us what it was like pursuing things like that back then.
Yeah, I was fortunate because my dad did a lot of reading. My dad, who grew up in advertising, he was influenced by a guy named Marshall McLuhan, who taught him when he was in college. And Marshall McLuhan talked about the medium being the message. And so my dad got me into computers early on. It was part of the choice of sending me to a school like Fatima College, where we had, one of the most advanced computer labs in the Caribbean for my high school education. And then just towards the end, when I was applying to MIT, MIT was really the only school I applied to. There was a book about the competitive nature of the economic relationship between Japan and the US. And they purported that Japan would pass the US with fifth generation computing technologies because of AI. And this was in the 80s. And Japan has gone really far. They're doing some things in the fields of robotics that the US is probably a decade and a half behind on, but it never really figured out how to use that competitively to overtake the US. So that war never really panned out, but it became a motivation for me to think about, because I was always interested in computers. I was one of the people that knew from even Form 5. Even when I was a teenager. I mean, I had a company in high school. I knew I wanted to start my own company. I knew that I wanted to have some degree in computer science. I even took a year off and worked at IBM before I went and actually selected studying computer science at MIT. But one of the things two things that MIT did, first of all, is they didn't really let us graduate with just bachelor's degrees. They, in a way, kind of forced the top half of the class to graduate with a joint master's and bachelor's degree, which I was able to complete in 4 years. But the other thing that they did is they really were one of the first schools to introduce a concentration in artificial intelligence. And that became, for me, just the obvious thing. When I did the head of class for AI, I graduated as one of the top students in the class without having any exposure to AI. So to me, it had indicated to me that whatever background and exposure I had been given from growing up poor and humble backgrounds in the Caribbean, I was able to think about AI the way that the people that invented the industry and defined most of the science in it at the time were themselves thinking about it and teaching it, and I could be successful in the field. So AI became my concentration, and that's what I graduated with 4 years later from MIT.
Wow. So Trinidad, Fatima
Yep.
to MIT, right? Focused on computer science. And so there's this thread of computing that you had throughout the entire time. And tell us a bit about your attitude in terms of you've achieved a lot in your career. What was your attitude back in high school versus once you got to MIT? How did that shift once you stepped into a new realm where I guess the base level of knowledge is very, very high? Give us some thoughts there.
Yeah, and I imagine a lot of kids are also thinking about their transition from high school to college as well. So I'll tell you about mine, which might be very different from other people. I was very fortunate, once again, mostly because of my dad, that he basically told me, just go and do whatever you like to do for A-levels. Go and kill 2 years.
Okay.
Now, unbeknownst to me, I know this now because I have a daughter who's young enough, and we're trying to select middle schools for her. So the equivalent of like hopefully a Fatima College quality education for her. Yeah, the thing that people have learned about education today is that if you let kids pursue what they're naturally passionate about, and you provide the support infrastructure to maximize their learning in whatever they're passionate about, you don't have to drill for any particular curriculum for them to be successful in a given curriculum. So for me, I actually didn't do much for A-levels until the last 6 weeks where I crammed for A-levels, because I thoroughly enjoyed the math that we were doing. I actually concentrated on probability because I just felt it was more useful and more applicable to the world than the mechanics, which I would have learned in physics. In any case, physics was intuitively obvious for me, for a guy like me. And then I did computers because, well, it was an excuse to hang out in the computer lab.
Okay.
Right. And so I did those subjects, ended up getting a national scholarship and going to MIT. And MIT was a whole different kind of worms, right? So you didn't have the opportunity at MIT to slack off for 2 years and then just cram. Every single subject at MIT was like an entire A-level curriculum, and you had to finish it in 4 months instead of 2 years. It was very intense. In fact, I went into the deep end of the pool. I ended up doing the equivalent in some semesters of 10 subjects. I don't know why I did that, but I did it because at that stage of my career, I was just unhappy being in the cold weather of Boston, and being on scholarship. I thought that to finish the masters that they had prescribed, I needed to get it done within the 4 years that the scholarship lasted. So I just crammed freshman year, sophomore year, even summer junior year. But then in retrospect, I realized how much of the other things that an environment like MIT offered, I had left behind on the table. And so fast forward later on in life, I think coming to Silicon Valley, I'm catching up on a lot of those opportunities now. But I think the common thing that I took out of my high school education and going into MIT was that whether you create a deliberate plan for yourself to forge through a tough goal, or whether you choose things that just naturally motivate you to get those goals accomplished, is really your decision. There are parts of life where you have to just forge through. It's not something you want to do or you enjoy doing, but you just have to get it done. Like taxes, everybody has to do taxes. I don't know anybody that would say they enjoy doing taxes any given year, but you have to get it done. On the flip side, going on YouTube and learning something new and trying to figure out how to apply it is enjoyable for most people. And if you have the kind of mind, especially if you can maintain the kind of mind later on in your career, where you continue to have a thirst for learning and trying to apply that knowledge to something that you believe in, I think you'll be very happy. I think you'll be successful in life. And I think you'll be quite healthy mentally and physically otherwise, because it'll keep you spirited and working on things that are of meaning to society.
That was, I think there are lots of nuggets for folks that are listening. And so what we're going to do is shift a little more into present day Silicon Valley, something that you mentioned. Tell us, right, you leave MIT and you hit the real world, no longer studying, doing tests. You have to build things. You have to provide value to a company. What was the mind shift like, and what was the journey up until now?
Yeah, so MIT is a highly academic environment for those who are interested in it. It's super academic. I mean, most people don't realize MIT has more graduates and PhD students than they have undergraduates, right? The undergraduates are not really a focus of the institution. There is an undergraduate research program that introduces people to the field of research from early on, but it's a break-even part of their business model, right? MIT's business model is getting grants from large corporations and the US government because of the research done by their masters and PhD and postdoctoral staff and students. And their professors obviously earn quite a living from building these companies, and probably not from the teaching, but from the research and the derivative intellectual property that is built off of that. That was not an environment for me. I was invited into the PhD program. I said, no, sorry, thank you, but today is my last day at MIT. Please sign my thesis. And that was it. I was done. I was done with MIT. And then I made this completely 90-degree turn into the world of consulting. I considered many different options for me on the table. And I was very fortunate. I had many different chances to go off and start a company or run a small business as CEO or what have you. But I actually chose to be an entry-level software engineer at a company called Sapient.
Okay.
And the reason I chose that was because I knew two things about myself. One is that I wanted to be immersed in the field of high tech. And second, I had not really been immersed in entrepreneurship at the level that I felt I had the confidence to go out and do it on my own. So I knew someday I wanted to start my own company in the US, but didn't really feel that I had role models at the scale. And these guys had taken a company and taken it public within 4 years, grew it at over 100% a year. And I happened to join just at the right time, where the co-CEOs of the company had put enough money in the bank that they cared absolutely nothing about trying to make more money. And they cared 150% about hiring the next generation of leaders. And I got the benefit of being groomed and mentored by them, not necessarily from a technology point of view, but from everything else. How do you facilitate clients? How do you lead people? How do you hire people? How do you fire people? How do you build global organizations? How do you deliver a project, a complex, multi-million dollar, $10 million project on scope, on time, on budget? It's very hard to do. Even today, our best and biggest companies don't know how to do it. So in my first 5 years, I got the benefit of that grooming, which was very important to the rest of my career, and quite frankly, very serendipitous, because as somebody that grows up in a place like Trinidad, the Caribbean, there's a tendency to lean towards the academics because that's what the people who taught us values. However, most of industry is just execution, and execution is not interesting to a British educated system, right? Execution is the thing that is done by the public service in Trinidad. And it's not necessarily regarded as the basis for competitive value add. But in the US, I think it's completely the opposite. Most of the companies that win are companies that do so 99.9% of the time because of their ability to execute. And so that was something that, as a Caribbean person coming from a high academic background, artificial intelligence or not, it was important for me to learn how that was done and what kind of environment must exist for things to actually get done in the real world. Because you could be as smart as you want.
Yes.
You could be surrounded by as many smart, motivated, high IQ, even gifted people that you want. But unless you guys are working on something together and delivering it consistently, time and time again, you don't deliver that value to the real world. So that was a lesson I learned in my first 5 years at Sapient.
So let's take a pause there. And one of the things that we're going to try to do a lot on the show is highlight what are the characteristics of the Caribbean background that enabled you to succeed on the world stage? So you mentioned that you decided to take a 90-degree turn into consulting, right? What elements of your Caribbean background gave you, on top of your education that you got from FIT, gave you the skill sets to just take a pivot like that very quickly into something else?
Yeah, so luckily, another Trinidadian coming out of MIT had also co-founded Sapient. His name was Anthony Jules, and he had also dropped out of the same PhD program that I had been invited to and turned down. And he was employee number 7 at Sapient. And that's a company that, as I mentioned, went on and grew at 100% a year, went public. And after 7 years, he essentially retired. But before he retired, he was one of the executive stakeholders that ran the recruiting that brought me into that company.
Okay.
So I guess the first thing to point out there is that, and I'm with you, one of the aspirations that I have for this channel is to assert the reality that it takes people from the Caribbean, people of color, to support other people of color being successful in all aspects of life.
Yes.
And it was very important that Anthony did what he did so that he could open the door for me. Otherwise, Sapient may not have necessarily been the thing that I would have said I could have succeeded at, and I may not have entertained it as well as I did as my top job opportunity, having other roles on the table, being CEO.
Okay.
And turning them down to become an entry-level engineer out of, I was employee number 1100 or thereabouts, right? Why would I turn down a CEO role to become engineer number 1100, right? But it was because I could be groomed and mentored in an environment crafted by somebody that I knew came from my background. And that was important to me. And I think it was ultimately important in my success at Sapient. So that was the first thing. I think the other things that we as people from the Caribbean have to offer is that when we build companies with a demographic that's much more representative of what the planet looks like. Okay, and the places like Silicon Valley that struggle to do this. It puzzles me why. I know why. It still puzzles me because every company I have built has been one of the most diverse companies people have ever seen.
Yes.
But don't ask me why other people struggle, other than the fact that that's what it looks like at the top, and that has to change. So I just think we need more representation at the top that comes from people like us. That's first and foremost. So that's one advantage of being from the Caribbean. Another one is, I think because we're so small as islands, and worse yet, we were divided and conquered by the British, we were forced to take what little we had and make the most of it. And especially in the field of artificial intelligence and in computer science and high tech in general, things are plentiful. There's big data, there's massive computing infrastructure, there's the world of the Internet of Information, of label images and all sorts of things that you could just take for granted.
Right.
But I try not to take things for granted, because I find when you take things for granted, you tend to make mistakes. You tend to lose your feet, and you tend to not really solve things at the level of excellence that they're supposed to be solved at before moving on to the next level of abstraction and modularity. And when you do that, you end up building a pretty crappy system that is based on a fallacy that ultimately crumbles and falls down exactly when you don't need it to, and when your shareholders are most vulnerable. Yes. Right. So I think starting small and building consistently on sound principles is a value system thing that we take out of the Caribbean. The third thing that I would say is that we just naturally seem to have a higher quotient of leadership coming out of the Caribbean. When I was at Harvard Business School, I was one of 5 people out of a class of 900 that had Trinidad and Tobago heritage. I was very proud of that. And these people looked like they came from all parts of the world, but they had Trinidad and Tobago heritage. And I think the fact that we were the highest per capita admissions rate from a particular diaspora says something. We might be small, but there's a certain punching above the weight class that we as a diaspora, whether it be the Caribbean or Trinidad or people of color have, that we tend to forget. And when we get into these different companies, people look to us as leaders, but we tend to eschew that in exchange for having more opportunity in what we feel is the more important technical domain. But sometimes playing the leadership role is more important than expressing your technical prowess, because there's many people that could express technical prowess, right? Go hire out of China and India and Singapore and see what kind of quality of people you can get there, right? But you go ask someone from Singapore what they lack the most, and they will tell you it's leadership.
Interesting. Huh. So lots of threads in that. And one of the things I wanted to highlight, or maybe ask you to dive into a bit, is this sticking, not necessarily sticking with your kind, but recognizing other people from the diaspora that say when you are in a world stage and using that to your advantage. So other than you getting brought into Sapient, which I find the decision of having a CEO position, right, which I think in the Caribbean, we are a little more bent towards titles, right? It's like, hey, I have this title and that's the great thing, versus the actual quality of the work and the impact of the work that is delivered at the title versus really having that behind your name. And I really admire that you took, hey, I could be a CEO, and that's a whole different career path if you play the game, but ultimately you went to learn, right, in a different environment. So keeping with the Trinis, and the other thing is you've kept a lot of your roots and your mannerisms as time has went on. And as a leader, how has it been, you as a person of Caribbean descent? Has it been shocking for folks to be like, hey, where is this guy from? Because if someone looks at you, they'll think that you're Asian, but hey, I'm from Trinidad or from the Caribbean. How do you use that to your advantage in the workplace?
Yeah, I was very fortunate when I was in environments where there were different opportunities to network and build relationships with people from ultimately where my heritage has come from, Africa and the Middle East and Europe and Southeast Asia and East Asia and Southeast Asia, South Asia, and and ultimately from the Caribbean. You have to take advantage of it, right? So I remember the first time I heard the name Barack Obama was at an African American students conference at Harvard Business School, right? Where I think it was Conrad Anillo, one of these senators, was there speaking, and he said, "We have the perfect candidate for the next election, but there are only two problems. One is his first name. The second is his last name."
Wow.
And I was very privileged to be sitting there where he was introduced to the business leadership, not just of Black leaders, but Harvard Business School leaders, as the incoming candidate, as the junior senator from Illinois at the time. And to be able to be part of an audience like that and have access to the things which will happen that will change not just the United States, but the world, is part of where we come from as people of color, as West Indians, especially in Trinidad, right? We have one of the most diverse cultures and ethnic heritages of any country. And so I think any Trinidadian should, regardless of what your race and identity and ethnicity might be, you have, I believe, an inherent advantage of being able to fit in with all of these different cultures from around the world. And I think one must take advantage of that, not just to learn where we came from as a people, but to also recognize that the role that we are being called upon to lead in the coming economy, we are actually probably amongst a diaspora that is the most prepared to lead in such a multicultural environment. Look at the people today who are being elected to lead at least this country. Kamala Harris, parents from South Asia and parents from the Caribbean. They've brought Susan Rice on board as well, right? she has parentage from Jamaica. In past administrations, there was Colin Powell, right?
Yes.
Incredible leader who ran the armed forces for the country, and did so with incredible humility and grace.
Mhm.
And that's in government. But who can we point to in our business leadership? Who can we point to in tech circles? Who can we point to in Silicon Valley? Well, there are people. It's just, I don't think people as yet know their names, but there are equivalent
Right.
many people from Caribbean and other diaspora. But just as a quick example, most people probably don't know who the heck a guy like Nicholas Braffett is, right? You plug in your iPhone every day and you experience the beauty of the round circular charger that Apple has, but nobody knows that that was invented by a Caribbean man.
Wow.
There are people like Anthony Jules, who I mentioned, built Sapient, has gone on to build robotics companies and sell them to Google, and is now running a company for Rodney Brooks, the inventor of iRobot. And then there's amazing people like people in our group, Professor Anil Kokaram, who has
Right. Yeah.
revolutionized how Hollywood does animation and multi-frame artificial intelligence to both preserve older movies and bring them into the 21st century, but also transform the way that we do some of these 3D type animations live in studio for today's most modern Hollywood productions. People don't know who these people are, and I think they need to. So, long answer to your question, but in short, I feel there is a huge advantage to come in from the Caribbean, but being able to relate to the things that people from all around the world, and not just the US, cares about that matter and will matter in the coming economy.
Perfect. So wanted to shift a little bit into, you finished Sapient, right? And you've built other companies as well. And I think from understanding your background, all of it has been in the space of healthcare to a degree. And that seems to be a particular focus of yours. Can you tell us, you've seen the evolution of technology, let's say back when AI started to take off, you've been at MIT, Harvard, and what should we be thinking of, let's say, in the space of healthcare? Let's tell us about what's happening there now and what's going to change, right? We're in the coronavirus times, and what opportunities do you see?
Right. So I've had the privilege of being part of digital health for about 20 years now. The first time I built a digital health company was 2001. It was a company called VLife. I was in charge of product and leadership on the team. And one of the key decisions we made was enabling the staff of VLife to use Python on top of a Java platform in order to encode business rules. And the business rules were meant for the purposes of health and well-being. So how do you devise a program to quit smoking? How do you help someone devise a program for weight loss? How do you manage an entire population across a Fortune 500 company's employee base, such that their inherent asset, their most important asset, which is their people, is enhanced in value on their balance sheet by billions of dollars, because you're systemically and deliberately improving the quality of the health of all of these employees, right? And that company was ultimately acquired by Cigna, which is one of the world's largest companies today, and it probably still runs the code we wrote as its basis for health and well-being for anyone that subscribes to Cigna, right? So I had the privilege very early on of touching and building that technology. So fast forward now to today. More recently, we were involved in building a company called Livongo. We brought our commercial capability of a company we were building in Boston to Silicon Valley. And we have seen the ability to execute once again in the sales trenches of healthcare, and how that can serve to complement the vast scale of what Silicon Valley brings to a company like Livongo, which was focused on diabetes measurement and intervention.
Yes.
Using a digital glucometer. A glucometer was connected to the cloud, and you could automate the responses to tell somebody, hey, your blood glucose level looks lower, it's out of band, you should probably drink 8 ounces of orange juice or something like that. And sit down for a while, right? This can prevent a lot of emergency room visits, just something as simple as that. So with that said, it's not like earth-shattering rocket science, super AI technology saving lives, right? These are very basic things which are just being introduced to healthcare today. And one of the things about healthcare is that it was one of the last industries to be introduced to high technology. And it still has a long way to go in terms of especially taking advantage of the next generation of technologies, which will involve artificial intelligence. Healthcare data is very siloed today. There are ways that it will become more and more open through data trusts and so on and so forth in the future. And so there will be many more opportunities to process that data, just like we were talking about earlier, about mining that data and creating value in a private, secure fashion that doesn't expose any of the violate any of the HIPAA regulations associated with patients' private healthcare data. But you have companies like Apple today that if they decided, they could become the world's largest electronic medical records company, right? But they're not going to build a healthcare company. So who's going to build the healthcare companies, right? We need more and more entrepreneurs who understand how data can be used, the data scientists. We need people who can use the machines to train on that data, the machine learning specialists. And we need people who understand what doctors and trained clinicians and the business professionals in the US $3.5 trillion healthcare industry would have had to do with manual labor in order to help patients make better decisions, help doctors make better decisions, help health plan administrators make better decisions. And the automation can bring scale, bring costs down. So many things. There's probably 40 years worth of runway of things that can be done in digital health. And we're very privileged that we were part of building what's today the first $50 billion company in this space. But my hope is that within 10 years' time, there'll be companies the size of Google in healthcare, because it is the world's biggest industry.
So I wanted to rehash a couple of things that I heard in there. And I think for the audience, right? Oftentimes when we have tech, we hear a lot about the Google, the Facebook, the Amazon, and that's almost thought of as the only way to pursue an extremely meaningful career in tech, right? You've done it in tech and healthcare and with the intersection of artificial intelligence. And I think I wanted to sort of raise that up, right? So you went to Sapient, and there's some other names that some folks may have never heard of these companies, but the impact that you brought to the marketplace was very high. And it showed in the valuations of those companies, and I'm sure your corresponding compensation from there. And I think one of the things I definitely wanted to use that particular healthcare piece for future careers is maybe let's chat a bit about what data modalities do you see, right? Is it image in terms of most opportunity? Is it image? Okay. Is it text? Is it voice? What do you see in the next 5 years as the data medium to focus on, let's say?
I think it's all. I mean, I think the reality is that the vast minority of data in healthcare is being used today for automating things which should be automated and should have been automated 20 years ago, if not 30 or 40 years ago. There are companies that are using voice to detect depression and create early mental health interventions. There are companies that are looking at the text that might be transcribed in a physician visit in order to automate away some of the bureaucracy and the rudimentary slowness of traditional workflows in healthcare offices across the world, around the world, and especially across the US.
Right.
And, I can tell you for certain, there are a bunch of companies that pat themselves on the back, the cluster of old EMR companies who have been around since the 1980s. What do you think is more important, your weight that your PCP has stored in a Cerner or Epic EMR system from last year, or the fact that you've been consistently taking more and more steps and either your Apple Watch or your iPhone has been tracking that. Which of those two data points is more valuable from an overall healthcare perspective? And by the way, that's just one of thousands of data points that Apple and companies like Apple are tracking on you that they don't even know what to do with, right? So where is the EMR? Where is the data? How is the value in the industry unlocked? There's so many questions to be answered, right? So I think I would be surprised if even 1% of the data in healthcare is actually being utilized. I wouldn't be surprised if it's 1% of 1% of 1% that's actually being used on a system that involves artificial intelligence today. And all of the ethical considerations aside, which again can be properly handled from being run by business leaders with the right ethical background and business processes that are well thought through. We still have a long way to go before we're even doing things such as looking at x-rays and proactively, or looking at MRI scans and proactively scheduling follow-up visits. One of the companies that we're building today within healthcare out in New York, they are using the transcriptions to look at when the radiologist had recommended a follow-up should occur. And then they're automatically reaching out through digital campaigns to these patients, and if necessarily via their primary care physicians, in order to schedule those follow-ups. It doesn't take a lot of data to do that, and they don't necessarily even use anything related to the MRI. But imagine if they could. Imagine if they could actually look at the data more closely. Imagine if they could suggest to the experts in the healthcare circle around that patient that there were other things that while they were scanning their lungs, they happened to see something going on with their liver, and they could preventatively recommend such deeper scans and follow-ups with the right specialists and cut pain out of the system, improve compliance, improve the patient experience, bring costs down, bring revenue for these clinics up. There's just so many ways that artificial intelligence could be used to improve the lives of patients and the people practicing healthcare. That's just in this country, which has 3% of the world's population. So imagine if you can take these technologies and then scale it up around the world, right? What a huge change we could make. And so I think there's 40 years worth of work to be done before we start approaching that kind of Star Trek level phenomenon of where AI can really go with the tricorder.
And I'm happy you're almost blatantly honest about the fact that, hey, there is a long way to go. And one of the things that stuck out to me in what you just said was you did some business rules. Okay. And that was an incredible innovation back then. And in some cases, business rules, they have a certain degree of certainty in the decisions that they make. And that's very important for machine learning, especially in healthcare, to not misdiagnose someone. And I think for the audience, especially what's very important for me in terms of, we're not just doing data science and AI, you're actually applying it to something. And one of the things that stuck out in a lot of the stuff that you said is almost being in that particular environment and being in that realm and speaking the lingo and not just talking about algorithms, but actually saying, okay, I use this type of algorithm and it's going to give me this type of result. And that's the actual benefit in reality. Note that there's, the whole academic pursuit of you put a paper out and these types of things, but in the production world and in the sort of financial driven world, using your data science to actually drive business value for users and different businesses is something that I think you've sort of just demonstrated in some of those things. And it doesn't have to be this magical algorithm that's defeating the best Go player in the world. It could be something very simple that solves a pretty hard, it might actually be a hard problem. No one has just solved it before. So I'm happy that you showed some of the levels that sort of occur in the space of innovation. One of the shifts.
Yeah, I think just a quick note on that, Mark, is that more and more Silicon Valley is going to be less and less horizontally applicable, and it's going to require people who really understand vertical knowledge about different industries that speak the level of the people and can empathize with the specific problems that need to be solved for. Because the power of AI and high tech is that you can solve problems at such a higher level of fidelity. But the question is, are you as a data scientist, as a person training machine learning, as a person applying AI, really, really clear about what is the situation that you're solving a problem into? And I would not do a whole lot, especially with a powerful tool such as artificial intelligence, unless I truly started there. And that's, I think, a fundamental thing that everybody professionally should make sure they check the box on before they go too deep into a particular company or a particular field or a particular endeavor.
Perfect. And hopefully this is some good information for the folks on the call. Wanted to shift, as we get closer to wrapping up. You've built and sold successful companies, right? And I'm sure in that process, there are many different feelings that you go through, tough times, really good times, and you're at the end. I'm not necessarily saying your career is over. I'm meaning you've achieved a lot, right? So what continues to motivate you, and what's one thing you're trying to do in the next 5 years?
Yeah, so there's quite a few things in there. So first of all, I'll just say, I've had the benefit of working with, some amazing people. Businesses are built and they are exited, and it's not the result of one person's endeavor, right? It's always the result of a team. Yes. I think everybody needs credit for the role that they've played in seeing our ventures through to success. Mm-hmm. I think the reality of it is that most people have to understand that, and this is tough for me, right? Because I'm coming from Trinidad. I'm in a field at the intersection of the world's largest industry and an emerging field such as artificial intelligence, and I have other areas of vast interest related to parallel computing and the coming economy that we're stepping into. But the reality that I can share, having crossed over that threshold, so to speak, as you call it, is that what gets you here cannot get you there. It's very, very clear to me that the education system that I went to all these fancy schools, MIT and Harvard, and you don't need to go to these schools to be a successful entrepreneur. In fact, I would say it's a disadvantage to go to these schools because you're a perfectionist, you have high standards, you turn people off because your peer, whether or not you're arrogant to be the smartest person in the room. Mm-hmm. There's all sorts of problems coming from high education and trying to build something of value, right? So don't worry if you don't necessarily go to the, as Mark called it, the number one school in the field. You should just be clear that you are the most passionate to yourself about what you're doing. And wherever you are, as long as you go to a decent enough school or you're immersed in a decent enough environment, surrounded by amazing people who will encourage you and groom you and mentor you, you will succeed in applying that forward. But the education system that we were given, especially coming from the Caribbean, the British, you got to go learn this prescriptive rote memorization type education system, the education system that talks about, I have a curriculum and you got to get all A's in this curriculum. That's not how the real world works, right? That is a world that, as much as I would credit my success and the success of many of us in this group on the teachers that got us here, that is a world that teaches you how to be a teacher. Right. But the world of entrepreneurship and being a CEO and a business leader and someone founding a company and capitalizing a company and exiting a company is a world which is based on making decisions based on impartial information. It's a world based on relationships. It's a world based on selling and the hard knocks of selling, understanding what sales is about, right? They don't even teach sales at Harvard Business School. It's such a disreputable industry, right? Really? But these are the things that one must figure out how to learn in one's career, just to even get here. And then beyond here, where do you go, right? So if you've achieved great success financially, personally, professionally, then your question mark is, where do you go next? And for me, I can tell you that you have to be able to go back to the things that you were most passionate about. So think about back to when you were a teenager and when there was something of interest that got you up in the morning, and you just poured your life and soul, and you just naturally learned whether or not there was somebody to teach you that you learned everything you could about that, and then you went off and tried to apply it to something that you valued. Everybody has such an experience in their life, and to be able to foster and facilitate that at a later stage of your career becomes very difficult, because your infrastructure around you gets more and more dependent upon the organizations that you're part of, the expectations of those around you. You have obligations and commitments to family, and some people have a mortgage, and there's things that hold you back from really spending the time in what you're most passionate about, right? They say to master something, you need to spend 10,000 hours before you can master it and really truly then go off and apply it. But how do you spend 10,000 hours when you barely have a couple of free hours in a given week? So I don't necessarily have an answer for you, because I am myself still in the process of figuring out how do I now need to reinvent myself. And part of it is it's through Studio IXORA, in ensuring that Studio IXORA is for me and for the people who are helping me build it, and hopefully everyone that becomes part of the legacy it's trying to create. It's an environment that allows us to express ourselves as people of color in a way that achieves things at the highest level, serving industries where there's very high demand for innovation and where there's growth potential in businesses that can be built in those industries. But at the same time, not compromise our continued need to understand who we are and be driven by that childhood, almost what is deliberately labeled by guys like Todd Rose, who wrote the book Dark Horse, as micro motives, right? The things that automatically just drive who you are. And so I feel everyone must be able to hold on to their, first of all, discover what your micro motives are. It's a lifelong journey. And then there will come a point in time where if you don't have that, you're probably going to just hit a plateau. You're either going to hit a plateau or continue working for the man in a way that just doesn't make any sense. And if you don't figure that out, you really are not going to have, I think, the independence and the freedom and capacity necessary to go off and truly accomplish something that represents a lifetime worth of learning and growing and contributing.
Wow. That was a lot in there. And I think one of the things that once again sticks out to me that I'm very happy that you mentioned is sales. So I think if there's anything that anyone takes from your background, it's an incredibly technical background, right? In addition to this notion of sales, and you spent a couple sentences on talking about sales and how in traditional education, that's not an actual sort of a discipline that they pay attention to, where that's probably one of the most valuable skills in the marketplace, when you can be both technical and also sell as well. And I think coming from the Caribbean, people of the Caribbean diaspora have a unique ability to relate to people and just flex. And we have a different type of swag to other people from different regions that allows us to, we're not even selling. I think sometimes it's just we're being ourselves, because I think communicating in a jovial manner is part of all of our cultures from that region. And yeah, I'm kind of happy you said sales. That's something that I try to keep as a pulse of mine, even as I push in my technical career. So perfect. As we get to the end here, what career tips, would you give to a high schooler? I'll pause there first. 2 career tips for a high schooler in the Caribbean region.
Yeah, I would definitely say forget the curriculum and really study what you're passionate about. It's very easy to get caught up in the curriculum. Not necessarily only speaking for myself, but there's a fundamental difference between learning and education. And you have to understand the difference, right? The role of high school is for you to learn enough to make it to college. The role of college is to learn enough so that you can be successful in the workforce.
Right.
That learning may or may not correlate to your grades.
Yep.
right? There was a time for me when I was all fixated on GPA and so on at MIT. And I
Yes.
realized these Singaporeans were like kicking my ass. They were cruising through and getting 5.0 GPAs without any effort. And I was just like, what the hell? I'm like struggling to just be 4.7 here. You know,
This
maybe
is
I'm
4.7 out of 4, correct? Like, what's the scale we're on? Or 5 out of
MIT
5?
scale is out of 5.
Out of 5. Okay.
But the reality, I mean, you could probably normalize it to other schools out of 4 in terms of the amount of work we have to do. But don't ask me why they have it out of 5 instead of 4. But
MIT.
you know, it's you have to be exceptional
Yes.
to get 5.0 at MIT. But that's not the goal of MIT, right? The goal of MIT is for you to learn. The goal of high school is not to get 3 A's at A levels or 7 1s and A's at O levels, right? The goal of high school is for you to learn, right? The goal of starting a company is for you to learn. Yes, there's a part of it which is the P&L and the cash flow and to be successful and to hire good people and to keep them and so on and so forth. But the goal of that is to learn. And the only way you can learn is to fail, right? Because if you don't learn very early on in your life, that there's one or two things happen when you do something. You either learn,
yes,
or you win.
Ooh,
right?
Okay.
And if you win, then that's great. You at least should think about what caused you to win and succeed and get a high grade or win a deal or get a scholarship or what have you. You should definitely reinforce what you think you did right. But more of the time, the actual learning happens when you don't accomplish it.
Yes.
And we're brought up in a culture where it's all about getting A's instead of B's and C's and F's, right? I mean, they scratched me off the list after they saw my mock exam results. I was not a scholarship boy, but the reality is that I had learned what I needed to learn, and cramming for 6 weeks was sufficient enough for me to get the highest grades in my category in the country. And that doesn't say much about the education system at all.
Yes.
Right? What does that say? It says that there is a test and it is beatable, right? But what does that tell you about what you learned, right? You have to separate the two. So I feel the only way you can learn, given how hard things have become to learn, is to really figure out the things that matter to you, that you're passionate about, and lean in on them. And to lean in on them, you have to be surrounded with people and resources that support you in learning those things. You could try to do it on your own. It'll just take a little bit longer and no one can write you off. But the ideal thing is for you to do it at school, in an environment where a teacher will support you, to do it at work with a manager that totally gets who you are and why what you're leading into can add superior value to the organization, the project, the team, right? And if you can't put yourself in an environment with the right teachers, the right people that you want to work with, the right managers, that's okay. Not everyone has that privilege, but go learn it on your own. But don't give up on the reality that you have to learn something. So that's maybe one tip that I would give. The second tip I would give for high school people is please apply to more than one college. Don't do what I did.
Don't do what you did. Yeah. Don't do what I did. I just applied for one on the last day. So if you know you're a slacker student like myself, I like to say that I was one of the biggest slackers, and ultimately it comes down to hard work. In my opinion, school is a game, right? They set up certain gates for you, and you have to play that game to get to the next level and get more opportunities, so to say. But like Geoff said, ultimately what you know and learn and can apply in the real world is extremely valuable. So second or third to last question, what would you tell professionals, right? We have several different listeners. We have high schoolers, we have college folks, and we have professionals as well. What's really important for them to succeed at this intersection?
I hope the people listening will push themselves forward in the field of data science or machine learning or artificial intelligence, right? Because this is the future, right? Where this industry is today is where the World Wide Web was in the 90s, right? And I remember when we built one of the first Caribbean websites at MIT and we brought it down to Trinidad on a laptop because there was no internet connectivity in 1994 to show the Trinidad government. They were like, what is this? This just looks like an encyclopedia on a CD-ROM, right? Why does this matter? They just didn't get it, right? So despite the fact that we got written up in PC Magazine as one of the world's top 100 websites, right? They just didn't have access to the things that, so don't try not to allow the dumber part of society, if I could characterize government at times to be that, to dictate, or your management or your family or the people around you, people who are not tuned into where the world is going. Try not to let them dissuade you from the things that you are pursuing in the field of artificial intelligence, because it will be as important as learning how to read a book, right? If you don't know how to do stuff in AI in the next 5 to 10 years, you will probably be operating on the lower end of the curve. And if you want proof that people who have studied this, you could go read a book called Machine Platform Crowd, written by Andrew McAfee and Eric Brynjolfsson. I think they're both MIT professors, and they have written several books, but that particular book, Machine Platform Crowd, talks really about the future economy that we are stepping into. And you can already see their predictions happening. That book was written around about 2017. A lot of the stuff that they talk about is already happening, both in terms of the global economy, in terms of high tech, in terms of digital currencies. It's one of probably the most important books that one must read as a professional, in my humble opinion. But in that book, you will see that there's a very different nature of what it means to be a professional, right? And it's not clear to me how many people will actually work in the coming society. It's quite possible that 1% of society might be able to run the entire global economy.
Based on all the algorithms, yeah, that makes sense.
Well, just based on data, right? Just think about a company like Google. How much of what Google does is actually done by the 50,000 people that they've hired? As far as I know, 49,000 out of the 50,000 don't generate any P&L.
Right.
They just do R&D.
Yep.
Right? So how many people does it actually take to run Google? Most of it is done by tons and tons of machines sitting somewhere in a cloud, in a data center, doing things which implements some modern day version of the algorithm that Larry, as a PhD student, invented 20 something years ago. And so are you going to be that PhD student? If you're not going to be a PhD student like me, are you going to be the professional that can think about the algorithms and the things that will be relevant in 20 years' time and invent those things? Or are you going to be the guy installing servers to keep the cloud alive? Or are you going to be the person dependent upon Google to pay taxes to the California economy in order to get a handout check as part of a universal basic income supplement 20 years from now? I'm pretty sure that those will be the types of rungs of professionals that will exist, if not 20 years, maybe even 10 years from now. So where in that vector, because the vector doesn't scale linearly, it scales exponentially. And you could just draw an exponential curve about how much of what we consider as economy is being done by the machine today compared to a decade ago, 2 decades ago, all the way back to the beginning of... Yeah, just plot it out and extrapolate it. And within 10, 20 years' time, it'll be very, very clear that probably 1% will actually be done by humans. And then there's the important things in there that we should talk about in terms of ethics and good leadership and this and that and the other, which I think as a diaspora, we bring to the table. But where you survive in an economy is a choice. It's a deliberate choice. It's stuff that you have to educate yourself about and become passionate about today, because that passion is going to drive you into making the right choices. If you make the wrong choices, if you hang out with the wrong people, if you hang out with the wrong influences, if you listen to the wrong podcasts, you're going to be part of the 80-20 society. And there's absolutely no guarantees that the people who are running a highly machine concentrated capital based economy 20 years from today is really going to give a damn about you. Look at what's happened to the entire Trinidad economy. It doesn't produce a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden, the powers that be decided, we're going to take away all of your natural gas economy. We're going to take away all of your natural gas derivative economy. We ran out of oil. We could not produce oil profitably. So what do we produce in Trinidad? What do we produce?
Yes.
What do we actually produce except PT dollars?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what props up the economy? So
what props up the economy? So you got to really think about that, and not just as Trinidadians, as whether you're from Trinidad or not. Think about your society, the society you're planning to be part of, and what the value structure of that society is going to look like. Read the books like Machine Platform Crowd and make your own decisions now, not 20 years from now. You'll be too late then. Make your decisions now about what things you're going to get excited about that you want to be part of.
Mm-hmm. I think for the folks on the call or listening, I think what's super important to keep in mind is that anyone can learn anything now, right? There's this notion
Absolutely.
of you went to the best school, I could go sit down and watch all the top courses at MIT, right? So I don't necessarily have to be in that environment to get that type of education. And in addition, the entire world, when it comes to machine learning, data science, AI, I would say all of, let's say, India is becoming data scientists, right? The curriculum in China is becoming more machine learning, like all the way to high school. I think I may have seen some things in primary school where different algorithms are altering your curriculum based on your progress. But ultimately, being ahead of what's happening in the world when it comes to machine learning, I think is something very important that Caribbean people living in the Caribbean especially need to pay attention to, right? Because in terms of the US economy, we have a nice time zone advantage, right? We're right on the East Coast. Yes, we're a little more expensive, so to say, when it comes to cheaper employment than the Indias and whatnot, but we do have the time advantage in addition, the accent and those types of things, right? Or the English. So for folks, just please, we're doing this to raise awareness about what's happening on a global scale with machine learning, and we're encouraging you, not necessarily trying to scare you, to pursue the field.
Yeah, and I just want to put a data point in there, right? One of the digital health companies that I built on the East Coast, because we were able to educate kids 8 months out of UE, University of the West Indies, on both what it was about building enterprise class technology solutions with Microsoft .NET type technologies, and B, the vertical knowledge that it takes to talk to an interface with an American healthcare client. We were able to generate for some of our employees $500,000 a year. Right? That was the revenue attributed to one single employee living and working in Trinidad and Tobago.
That's insane.
And the reality of it is that gets accentuated even further, right? Companies like Oracle have a revenue value add per employee of something like 60 million, because they're more product-oriented companies. Think about what the revenue per capita is at Google, when in reality, it only takes about 200 of their employees to keep the search business unit running.
Yes.
Right? Well, what's that? It's close to infinity, right? So that number can go very, very high on a per capita basis. But you just have to be in the right part of the industry. It doesn't matter if you're physically in Trinidad, in the Caribbean, Africa, Middle East, Asia. It doesn't matter where in the world you are today. The reality of it is it matters where you are in the global pecking order of where value is created. And how your skills and understanding of how industries work are tied towards a technical skill. I think it's really hard to participate in the coming economy with some degree of technical background, in my opinion. And that doesn't have to be just mathematical or scientific technical background. It could be liberal arts technical, right? You could be a lawyer, right? Or a doctor, right? So the choice is yours. But the choice has to be made early and strategically. And it's very hard for people to help if you're left behind later on. Right? You just think about it, right? If you had to get your parents a job today, if they were not employed, if they were retired, what job would you get your parents in the digital economy? And that's over the last 30 years. They've moved out of the workforce. What could you possibly find them in your world today? And that's that delta between you and the field you're in today compared to where they were 30 years or so ago is going to become even more accentuated if you have kids. By the time your kids are professional age, what will you be doing? You're probably still going to be looking or needing an income or some means of supporting yourself, because unlike our parents, you're not just going to live to 80, you're probably going to live to 100. God hoping, right? So you got to really think about that and where you choose to fit in the global pecking order. There are some countries that don't have the choice, like South Korea and Singapore. They just did whatever the hell they had to do to survive in a global economy, and they've thrived. Whereas we're a little bit happy in Trinidad. We have oil coming out of the ground. We have music, we have our carnival, we have our wonderful culture, and so on and so forth. But what have we really done to position the economy to be part of the global food chain that is now dominated by countries, by companies that are bigger than countries, such as Tesla and Google and Microsoft and Facebook? What have we done?
Yeah, that's the looming question, and we don't point fingers or poke things at that, but for each of you listening, think about what your own influence is on that overall scope, and keep in contact with different folks, keep in contact with us to continue building the community. So Geoff, the last two questions I have are, what are 3 principles you live by? Let's start with that one.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, and I think this is to the crux of what we were talking about, right? I think it is really important to have a clear understanding of who you are and the type of environment that has gotten you to where you are in order to succeed. Some of it comes from your parents, some of it comes from your teachers, but some of it you have to deliberately choose for yourself, right? So for me, I believe that I have benefited from sticking with people with the highest of ethics, first and foremost, because it means that whatever I do, it has a stellar reputation, and with a reputation like that, it tends to be capitalized and accelerated by the people that run the economy that want trustworthy people running it. Okay, so you could probably make a mistake about once before you're not excused, well, before you're excused from being part of that economy, right? So preferably you should try not to make too many mistakes when it comes to the important stuff, the ethical side of the equation. And hopefully you have a really good, strong moral and ethical compass such that you make no mistakes, right? That's one of my key principles. I don't work with anyone or any companies who demonstrate poor ethics. I think you have to find the genuineness. I think you have to find the genuineness in the people you work with, in the companies you work with, in the problem that you're trying to solve, right? A lot of people have business plans, or a lot of people work for companies, and when you ask them what problem they're really solving, they can't really answer that question. I think there's a genuineness lacking there. And in yourself, you have to be very truthful and genuine to yourself about what really motivates you and what you love doing. And the more you can answer that, is the more you will have this universal generated natural energy which propels you forward. And then the third principle that I would say is you got to have the hunger and the motivation for contributing something. Most of us grew up with scarcity coming out of the Caribbean. And you have to think about what matters to you, right? What are the things that you try to change so that for your kids and for your family and for your community and your society, there are things that you care about that they just did not have, that you are willing to, and you've naturally found yourself making sacrifices on behalf in order to solve for. And these are important things that drive one's own value system, right? But if you understand where that hunger and motivation for doing something comes from, I think you'll go a long way, because you can continue to find other people that help you build on it and harness it. And maybe I'm a little bit older than the people listening here, but you'll eventually come to realize in life that the more you give is the more of that energy that you will receive. I don't think it's necessarily true. The more you give is the more you will receive. I do think, however, the more you give is the more of that energy you will get back for yourself. Yeah.
That's an interesting version of that sort of traditional saying. So my last question is, one of the things I want to highlight, especially for the younger readers, I was never a big reader in my life and started to appreciate that a lot more now that I'm in contact with folks such as yourself mentoring me and realizing the importance of reading in your career and overall learning. I don't like to necessarily say education because that's typically bounded by, the traditional institutions, but what can you sort of apply and imply from the thing that you learn? So what 3 books would you recommend? You mentioned 2, so I'm gonna maybe sneak those 2 off your list, right? Machine Platform Crowd, was that the first one?
Yeah, Machine Platform Crowd by Andrew McAfee and Eric Brynjolfsson. Highly recommend that one.
You said Dark Horse as well, correct?
Yeah, Dark Horse is a book by a guy named Todd Rose that talks about the reality that 60% of us are probably exceptional. It's just that we live in a society that doesn't bring those exceptions to bear. And so I think it requires a democratization of the understanding, which is what he has done, that is actually a gift you can give yourself. And if you give yourself that gift, life becomes a lot happier and a lot easier. You may or may not necessarily change your financial outcome, but definitely the first 2 will change.
Good to know. And what would be the last one? Yeah, I would ask you for 3 more, but if you have them.
I think especially for those who might want to see what it looks like from at least the point of view of where I am in Silicon Valley to build the companies that are going to matter in the next decade or so. A book that you should read is $1 Trillion Coach, which talks about guys like Bill Campbell and how they have groomed and harnessed the power of a place like Silicon Valley, but finding people like us, right? There's just not enough people like us from the Caribbean here, which is why we're not necessarily represented at the top. But of the people that they have found and groomed and mentored, this book talks about what they do, how they do it, why those people are successful, how you should do it once you're in that position of leadership and privilege in order to accelerate the success of others. And ultimately, how do you build a company that $1 trillion aside has $1 trillion worth of impact? And these are things that I try to wake up every morning and think about.
Perfect. So once again, thank you for your time and sharing your energy and honestly, I would say continuing to push our minds, right, of the people of the Caribbean diaspora to push to achieve more, right, and to be continuing being world class, right, across sort of the entire population as much as we can. And yeah, appreciate the lessons and looking forward to another conversation coming up.
Great. Hope this was helpful. I think we can do great things together. So thanks for having me, Mark.
All right. Take care. Bye. Thanks for listening to today's interview with Geoff. And I hope you took away some great perspectives for your own journey in machine learning, AI, and tech. Remember that your Caribbean heritage is a great asset for your professional career. So take advantage of it and keep working on your skills. Later.